Thanks so much for coming, Daniel. I really appreciate that you took your time and joined me in this my second episode of like podcast, like where I have like guests on my channel. This is something new, and I'm really excited that you are here. Welcome.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, and I've actually been waiting for this moment when somebody's going to invite me so I can be a guest one time. So yeah, really happy to
Yeah,
be here.
I always had this idea that the one time I want to ask you questions and just like, have this kind of like conversations where you're the one who, get to talk more and express more of your kind of like thinking. So I'm glad that we kind of like get together like this. I was thinking that maybe we can start with just, if you could just say a couple of words about like your projects, because I think that most of people who are going to watch this already know you. So, but maybe just there are a few people who don't. It could be quite helpful.
Yeah, totally. And so let me share like kind of some of the projects I'm working on that I'm really excited about. One of them that actually think almost very few people probably have heard of is this docu-series. And what is a docu-series? Docu-series is basically like a documentary, but as a series, like as a TV series format, like over time, right? And so what I hope to do is to show like, what you talk so often about, the recovery journey, like how it truly unfolds, over a period of time for someone. And just very quickly on how this came to be was like, I've had this idea in my mind for a long time, but my idea was something like, a show where you like go into someone's house. Like I would actually go to someone's house, someone with insomnia, and they would be like, this is where I sleep. And then you see the blackout curtains, you open the medicine cabinet, it's like all these like, and it's like, oh, I'll go around and being like, okay, I see. And then, sit down and then interview and talk to them and then follow them over time, over like many months of kind of like, and show the project. So that was in my mind for a long time. And randomly, this guy named David, who's doing coaching for people who are getting off benzodiazepines, he connected with me, and he's also very interested in filming, so I just mentioned it to him, and he's like, "Oh, this is a great idea." So he's like, "We should do this," and we talked a lot about it. So I've flown to Florida a few times and had some interviews with volunteers, and hopefully that will be something that maybe is picked up by Netflix or Amazon, who knows, or maybe it'll just be one pilot episode that we show on YouTube. But that's what do you call it? Like our the name that we have now, like our working title is The Sleep Whisperer. So that's The Sleep Whisperer is one project. And then maybe I'll just mention one more. And it's actually completely different. And this is like, a lot of people who are listening here, I'm surely aware of like this kind of technological revolution when it comes to artificial intelligence, stuff with ChatGPT and that's going on there. So I've been spending quite an amount of time like compiling this big Excel spread of like a question and answers, like very common question and answers that we get, and like kind of training this chat bot that we call Ellie to answer questions. And
you had an episode right recently.
Yeah, oh yeah, I just started a new series called like Learning with Ellie, and it is so fascinating, Alina. Like the first time I got to sit down with this model and we had trained it on like about 300 questions, it was like I like 80% of the time it was like, oh, this is a decent answer. Then maybe like 10% it was like, oh, this one is kind of completely off. But 10% was like, oh my gosh, this is like I can't have written this better myself. So there's something there that I think will be incredibly valuable in time. Like, I think sleep coaching is so much about the human to human connection. Nothing will ever replace that. But we are humans. We can't answer questions like back to back to back to back to back to back like a robot. And like, but having kind of getting decent answers like that, like moment after moment, like just one after another, I think can be really helpful for a lot of people to start really understanding, because you essentially get the same answer all the time, but like different variations, but it can be really helpful. So this Ellie, getting Ellie out there and working, etc., is my other, project I'm really excited about.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing, and I'm super excited about this as well. But I also wanted to mention like your biggest project, which is like your the Sleep Coach School and the channel, and so just for anyone, if there is anyone who has insomnia or like, looks for, things how to approach it, doesn't know the, Daniel's channel. So it's the Sleep Core School channel. And there are a lot of videos, a lot of content, which is, I think, super helpful for anyone who just, tries to find, the solution to this very paradoxical and very, difficult problem as insomnia. Yeah. And I what I wanted like to, as the first thing to say is basically that I'm super thankful for your project, for your YouTube channel that you started. I don't know, it's like 5 or 4 years ago, I think.
Yeah, 2018, so it's 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's time flies. But I'm super, glad and that I found when I was, in the beginning of my struggles, and it helped me tremendously on my recovery. And what really fascinated me was how much understanding you have of on this kind of like issue. And one thing what I noticed that was kind of like interesting is that when I found out that you actually didn't have insomnia yourself, but you were working with, patients because you were, you were working as a sleep physician, right? For me, that was like such a, refreshing thing to hear, because mostly when you go to a doctor, usually the way how it's kind of like handled is it's very authoritative, and there's not so much like, at least like for many people that I heard, like who dealt with insomnia, and I personally also went to a few doctors, what I noticed that there was a lot of misunderstanding, and people were kind of handled in a dismissive manner. So it was, I can understand that for someone who never struggled with insomnia, it's really hard to really understand what people are going through. But you had this phenomenal ability to actually really understand them. So I was just wondering, like, how is it possible for you? Like, what qualities or what things helped you to actually kind of like learn from, from this, people's experiences, and, and from that extract your own teachings on that. So just curious about that.
Oh, that's a very nice question. And well, firstly, I'm so glad you found it, and just just to sneak this in there, because I think this will be really fun for your audience. Back when I started, when the YouTube channel was new, I would actually just encourage people to email me, and then I would have these kind of like private conversations with followers. And then if I found something really nice, I would post it on the YouTube channel. And I remember you emailing me like these long emails with kind of like what you were going through. And I was like, oh, wow, this is so interesting. And then I posted it on the channel. And I specifically remember you saying like, Daniel, I figured out like, if I'm scared of sleeping on the left side of the bed, then I do that on purpose to just show my brain. And like, I called that like the fearless method. And I was like, it was a great time. It was a great time. And I'm so happy you found it. But okay, to get to your question, I would say the following, that for me, it started with, I was a sleep doctor. I had some training in like CBTI, right? And I was seeing all these people with insomnia. And I was thinking like, okay, I'm gonna do this thing I've been taught, like the CBTI, but a lot of people just disappeared. They wouldn't come back to me, and some people came back to me and said like, I'm sleeping better, but I don't know why. And I was like, well, of course you have more sleep drive. It's like that. But I always had the sense, over time, they developed a sense in me that there's something more here that isn't really like, that I'm missing, something like that. So that was kind of happening. But at the same time, and this was also back in 2018, at the same time, I was thinking, I was still a believer basically in CBTI, even though I had seen kind of something was fun, a little off, but I was still a believer. So I was like, I'm going to create an app to like really get this out to everyone, like kind of, and I was thinking of it like partly as altruistic, like help people, and partly I was also like, kind of a business thing. Like I was like, oh, and this could also, help bring in some income for me. Like, so I'll say those are two motivators that led me to eventually, create the YouTube channel, right? Because I was like, okay, I have to have some way to like, reach people that then will be interested and will try this app, right? So that's where I was at. But in that, when I started the YouTube channel, that's when my understanding started to really develop, because people would ask questions in the comment section, and I was like, how do I answer this the best way? And I was like, I think this is the best way to answer. And I realized that that wasn't really aligned with CBTI, but it's still clearly from the response I was getting from the community was more helpful. And that's how it started developing. And then more and more engagement. And, it's kind of like almost like trial and error in a way. Like you have an idea, like, I think this is a sound idea. You present it to the community, people give you feedback. You're like, oh, that was a great idea. I'm going to stay with this one. Oh, this one's not so helpful. Probably not true. So that's kind of the manner in which it developed. But I just want to add one more thing, which was that in a weird way, the kind of constructive process of creating this like nano philosophy, which I call it now, is actually like it's in a weird way the same process that also leads to insomnia. And what I want to say here is that when we give our brain kind of this vision, this North Star, and tell it like, this is what I want, go figure this out, it just does that. And for me, it became, I want to completely understand insomnia, and I want to find a way to spread this teaching to people in a way that can sustain me as become on a business idea. So that was kind of like, I gave my brain that vision, if you will, and it started working on it. It's still working on it nonstop. It's constantly working on it. I always thought, this, but it feels nice. It's kind of constructive, right? But it's the exact same process. Somebody who has trouble sleeping gives the brain the vision, like, make me sleep. You got to figure out how to make me sleep, and it goes full on, like, okay, try this, do this. But bizarrely, it's the same process. But anyway, back to you. That's kind of my answer.
But it's actually brilliant. I haven't thought of it this way, because it's really true. Like when you give like a task to a brain, then it starts generating ideas, what we usually call like problem solving, right? So now it's like when the task is to understand something better, then it begins to generate solutions that are more helpful in a way to understand and find like some new answers, rather than when we give the brain task like avoid this, then it starts building this kind of unhelpful behavioral and thinking patterns that kind of keep us stuck. But it's a really interesting like way of thinking. But I was wondering, like, when you were replying to those questions, and you were not going by the books of CBTI, where did you get those, like, where those answers were coming from? Like, was it something from your personal life, or like were you trying to kind of like put it or kind of like try it on yourself, like how it would be perceived, or how was it?
Oh yeah, that's a great question again. And I've been thinking about this actually lately, that one of the sort of fundamentals of how I think and operate is I believe without any hesitation that we humans are like, the fundamentals of how our brain works is the same. That's my fundamental understanding. There's nothing different from me and somebody who's struggled with insomnia, or there's nothing different from me and somebody who's had difficulties with depression. Like we all, the fundamentals are the same. Our brain operates the same. It's just some circumstances that led somebody in this direction to that direction. So I believe, we can find the answers to everything by looking within. I truly believe that. Like, and that's the fascinating thing with our space, is that we don't necessarily need a lab and equipment and like a fancy stuff. We can just spend a lot of time thinking about our own thought processes and how our own mind operates, and then kind of generalize that and be like, oh, I understand how this person's thinking based on how I'm thinking. So that has always been there, but I don't think I fully realized that until maybe more recently. But to be a little bit more specific, I can give you one example. There was somebody, I think his name was Anthony, but he went by Tuan. So in the early episodes, you will find a lot of like, my conversation with Tuan. I read out communications with him, and I remember him saying something like, "Hey Daniel, like, I'm sleeping about like 5 hours or something like that, and I would really like to get to 6, and I'm spending about like this amount of time in bed. What do you think I should do?" And then I remember writing to him and saying like, well, according to traditional CBTI, you should like spend less time in bed to like make sure you sleep like almost like a large chunk of this time spent in bed you should be sleeping, and then you can gradually extend it. But I remember emailing him, but on the other hand, maybe you could also see it as like, this is where things are now, and just not change anything. And maybe by not change anything, things would get easier. And I remember him saying like, I hear what you're saying, Daniel, but of course I want to change something. So I'm going to go by, like I was like, okay, but that stuck to me. Like I was like thinking a lot about that. I was like, intuitively, it feels to me as if option B there is more helpful. It just felt like that's more helpful to me. And that was one of those moments where like, okay, I started to drift away from traditional CBTI, but I know this answer was fuzzy, but this is, this is how close to it as I can describe it at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of this kind of like thought-provoking processes like happens from like when people ask like trickier questions, and then we realize like something what we used to know doesn't anymore like align with how we actually like feel or what feels right to us in the moment, and that's how it kind of creates this an opportunity for a new knowledge to arise. For me, it was like I started noticing as I was learning a lot of things. I started noticing parallels in other areas of life in terms of like I was using that as analogies. Like I don't know if any analogy comes to my mind. I had a ton of them basically, so I always try to kind of like explain it like in a way that has the parallel kind of principle of working in other areas of life, and this helps me to kind of like apply to things that we deal with during insomnia. But of course it cannot be 100% exactly as it is like in other areas, but I would say that the general kind of principles, they are, I would say, true to in many situations. So and as you were speaking, I just remembered like this concept that you came up with, this timeless principle, and it is so unique because I haven't heard it anywhere actually, like never ever like in any other program. And this principle is so simple. It's so like there's literally nothing much you need to do. Actually, it's actually the opposite, not doing. And how did you came up with that one?
Oh yeah, no, very nice question again. And I want to, there are two shout outs here. One is, the understanding that like the process that has been really helpful in kind of constructing a philosophy is the same as kind of drives insomnia. That actually was made clear to me by our friend in Italy, Diego Somavia. He came on the show and he had that realization, and I realized this is very true. So shout out to Diego from La Scuola del Somno or something like that. It's in Italian, so I'm probably saying it wrong. But now to the timeless principle, big shout out to Michael Schwartz, who really started the sleep coach school with me. I remember meeting him the first time, and that was actually in that sort of like the famous video where me, Michael, and Martin is sitting in a kind of round table and talking. And what united us, the three of us, was Twitter and CBTI. The three of us were kind of like CBTI believers, and we were on Twitter. And then we happened to all three live in Oregon. So I was like, why don't we get together? So we got together. And it was one of those moments, it was so fascinating because I'd spent a lot of time thinking, and I met these two other guys, spent a lot of thinking, and we had like different ideas. It was kind of like, I like the analogy of being like a biologist, and you've only like studied like, North America, and then you find yourself in Madagascar or something like, oh, wow, things are similar, but different. Oh, like this is really interesting. And what interested me with Michael's approach was that he used the sleep diary, but not how I would use it. I still use it in a kind of traditional CBTI way, sort of getting a sense of people's like sleep efficiency, calculating, adjusting stuff. But he was like, nah, I just use it like people write down their questions. And then I was like, but how do you do like your sleep restriction? He was like, I just tell people like, get up about this time, and then I tell them to just like stop checking the time, before you go to bed. And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. And so initially I was like, okay, that's going to be my kind of like second step. If I feel somebody's kind of getting really, really stuck with numbers, I'm going to tell them, you know what, just stop checking the time instead, And then I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I was like, maybe it's better to start there. Maybe it's actually better to start where Mike is at. And so that basically became this timeless sleep when I realized I think that's more helpful. So shout out to Mike for that. And then, the step from there to seeing that the timeless principle isn't just about like night to night, but it's also about the journey in general. That whenever we have like, oh, I have to be done with this at this point, when it's something we can control, it's very tricky. So it went from this kind of time of sleep window to more general, like the timeless way in general is really helpful. So, but that's where it came from.
Yeah, no, it's also interesting to know the origin story of that concept, because it's like, again, it's super simple, and it can be so helpful, especially at the beginning. I would say that eventually I personally like started with this, and it really like it made a huge difference because it just didn't feed any more information to my brain that's already been problem solving how to avoid wakefulness, and this has been like really helpful at first. Like, of course there is a lot of anxiety, because like, oh my god, how are you supposed to know how much hours you're getting if you're not checking like time? And yeah, and then I realized that as this tool has been helping me, at some point I realized that I can actually let that go and just be neutral towards seeing time. And that also actually helped, because then it was like, sometimes when we create one rule to ease on or bring more or maybe like remove pressure on ourselves, right? So we stop checking time, and then after a while that becomes a little bit kind of dogmatic, and then we feel like more anxiety from if we accidentally check the time. So I was like, I started noticing these patterns in myself, and I realized, you know what, I would go also again like this effortless way, in a way that I would just like, so what, I check time, that's okay. And this is how I kind of built a neutral perspective on seeing time. So I no longer needed to check it, but I knew that even if I saw it, it's okay, it's not a big deal. So that was very helpful. But I think this principle of effortlessness in this in a way that we let go of monitoring and trying to manage our sleep schedule and sleep duration, that's definitely very helpful.
Very helpful. And just quickly want to add something that is a kind of segue from what you said about like seeing how principles you teach applies to yourself, right? So one of them is along these lines of numbers, that I was spending a lot of time on YouTube, like generally saying like, don't check the numbers, don't don't analyze and focus and things like that. And then I was like, at some point I was like, what do I do every morning? I check like how many new subscribers I have, how many views to this kid. I was like, it's exactly the same thing, And I was like, and I did at some point, I was like, this is kind of making me nervous. I'm going to stop checking. And I stopped checking, and I did feel like things were getting easier for me. But on the lines of what you said too, like now I often check. I check, this frequently, but it doesn't bother me. So it's like okay to do. But anyway, just a little pointer about like it's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, it's very similar to me as well, because before, as I was also writing, like content for my Instagram, also making like YouTube videos, I also at some point started kind of like being obsessed with numbers, because it was like at first it's like it's exciting, right? It's like someone subscribes or like writes a comment or anything, there is this kind of like dopamine, like, oh wow, nice. But then after a while it becomes in a way this kind of anxious moment. It's like, if for some reason the numbers are not looking the way how I would like them to, then I would start pondering what is wrong and so on. And this is exactly how I went also. At some point I just realized like, whatever, I will do what I can do. It's like anything that is in my control, that this is the only thing that I can do. The rest is like, I don't mind whatever the numbers are. And paradoxically, actually, I stopped checking numbers. I don't really follow that frequently, but whenever I do, it's actually, I see the consistent kind of growth, even though I probably put even less out, like put less content, on my platforms, but yet the numbers are still kind of growing. So that was also interesting observation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. I think what I wanted also to ask you, and I actually yesterday I also posted on my Instagram a story where I asked people, just I'm going to have a talk with you, and just in case people want to hear or hear us talking about particular topics, so that they would suggest. And I just made it like a list of some things that people mentioned, and one of them, and this topic I also had on my mind when I was still struggling, and I was watching your videos. I was binge watching them at night. I was like, oh my god, that was like my way of befriending wakefulness in a weird way. But And I remember like there was a recurring thought as I was watching your videos. At that time, I think you were not really speaking about your personal kind of relationship with sleep. And I always had this kind of a like thought, like, does Daniel have, insomnia, or maybe he didn't have. And then I noticed that inside me there was this kind of like fear to know either of those answers, because it would mean like if you had insomnia, then I would be so curious to know how you are doing now. How is your sleep now? And what if it's not, that great? And that would be like, oh my God, like then I will have to, deal with this forever. And then the another fear was that, but if you didn't have insomnia, how could I know that I can, this is something that will 100% like, help me recover. There was this kind of hesitation. And there was also like yesterday a person like mentioned the topic about like, what's the situation like with Daniel's sleep. And yeah, but I just wanted like, just to give you, opportunity to maybe share something like from your personal, maybe like relationship with your sleep, maybe like, maybe there were situations where we're like very similar to kind of like insomnia type of things. And yeah.
Oh yeah, there's so much to talk about here that could be interesting. But firstly, I want to answer by sharing something I've actually never talked about, which was the more like the question of like your relationship with sleep. I have shared on the channel that I've never had an insomnia struggle, but how about my relationship with sleep? And looking back on my life, I would say I think I fall into the category of people who never had a relationship with sleep. It happened, and never really thought about it. And like a quick segue here is like, interestingly, that we talked about how you kind of look in with yourself, and then you think, I think probably people are all like me, and so you teach that. And so for a long time, I would teach that, when we have insomnia and we start having a relationship with sleep, but before we didn't have a relationship with sleep. It was just something that happened automatically, and I assumed everybody was like me, but that's not actually true. So sometimes people came up and they were like, but Daniel, like, all my whole life, I was a great sleeper. Sleep was a great part of my life. So, and then you have to tweak that, and you have to think about it like, oh yeah, this is of course true. But anyway, that was a little segue that ties into everything we talked about, I think. But in terms of like insomnia, yeah, I never had an insomnia struggle, but I've definitely had nights where I've had like thought patterns that I recognize very much from our community. And these are like, I go to bed and I know I'm nervous, excited, or anxious or stressed. Something is going on, right? And I don't fall asleep. My wife is sleeping, and I feel this kind of nervous energy within me. And I'm like, I think I've been here, like I've been just laying here for an hour. I don't think I want to do this anymore. I go upstairs, and I kind of like, I take the wall clock without looking at it, just turn it upside down. I don't want to know the time. And then I read a book, and then I'm like, I think I've probably been up for like 34 hours. And like, I remember one time, like when I was working as a doctor, I was like, I have to go to work in a couple hours. I hope I get some sleep, because if I don't, then I know I have to do so much better if I just do a little sleep. And so I recognize all that. And I think one time I actually, as far as I know, and we don't know this, but I think there was one night I didn't sleep at all. But I wasn't, again, I didn't react to that with like a lot of anxiety, but I was anxious, and I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And the day went fine. But anyway, I'm just sharing this so I know, like, I never had an insomnia struggle, but I have definitely can recognize a lot of those thoughts that can happen when we're up at night. And there was something else I really wanted to comment on. Your question was about like the relationship with sleep, and so, oh yeah, now it came back to me. You said like if Daniel has had insomnia himself, then on one hand maybe that's helpful because he will totally get it, and if he can get out of that, then I can too. But if he has never had insomnia, that's like then the helpful part of that could be that I'm not going to wonder how he's doing. So I said the same thing you, but kind of like the positive spin on it. But anyway, what I wanted to share here was this, that I think what I think there's an incredible value, like when you're a coach, to have gone through the journey like you, Michelle, and really the vast majority of the coaches we know. But I think there is something of value too of not having gone through it, which is the kind of complete outsider's perspective, you know, where you're like, you're not scared to talk about anything, you know. I may say something that if I hadn't someone myself, I'd be like, I can't talk about that, but I'm like kind of clueless in a way, so I'm like, let's talk about this or let's talk about that. That can actually be helpful. And also the part where you don't go into like, oh, this helped me, so this will help you, because I don't know anything about that. So the complete outside perspective, I think, you know, it has some value too. Yeah, I'll conclude there. Back to you.
No, but it's actually a really good point, because I would say that it's not only just like an outsider perspective, but it's also a perspective of someone who really understands the topic and yet has the, let's call it like qualities of a, you know, normal sleeper, you know. So someone who will really can observe their own current relationship, or maybe the absence of relationship with sleep, patterns, like thinking, the ways how you think, and then basically communicate that the way how you think about that, because that could be really helpful. It's not really kind of like filtered through that you know, layer of this kind of like fear and, you know, like the typical kind of like insomnia patterns. So I think that that's also a huge value. And personally, I think what also helped me a lot was your kind of like positive attitude and your very kind of like light way of presenting information. Because I remember when I was really struggling on some, like, you know, all-nighters, and it was like, you know, third or fourth all-nighter, and I was like already kind of on edge. And sometimes like listening to someone talking about this kind of like issue, but in a light way, that actually helped me. I kind of like took away the weight of that you know, situation that I was going through. And this was definitely helpful. Like maybe a little bit like not attached way of communication is definitely benefit there. Yeah. And one of my kind of like this kind of like OCD thoughts was there, like is it possible that by talking like someone who never had insomnia, right, and then talk about insomnia and then actually acquiring insomnia. But this was like, again, like I'm just saying my thinking when I was struggling, right? Because I had so many curiosity, like how is it possible that someone can talk so much freely about this issue and not being triggered, right? So yeah, and these kind of thoughts were constantly like appearing in my mind. And yeah, I just wanted like to share, like it's this, like have you ever wondered, like, is it possible to consciously teach yourself to fear wakefulness, like intentionally?
It's so interesting.
I'm asking
question,
tricky questions.
Yeah. No, that's great, which is it's so fun. I actually am enjoying this so much, to be honest with you. I'm really enjoying this because it's kind of new questions, new ideas. I would say my short answer to this, I believe that's no. I think when you approach something, you know, kind of like with curiosity, and you talk about something, you know, I don't think you can make yourself scared of something when you approach something in that way. But it's, yeah, it comes up very often. And I'm sure you probably get this question even more than I do, which is like, how can you, Lena, like you went through this, and how can you now casually talk about this without being scared? But it's very, you know, it's very possible, like you're living proof of. And in fact, I would say it's almost going kind of back to myself. I think it's almost the opposite. I think before I started like really learning about sleep, who knows? I could have had insomnia, you know, it could have happened, right? But with the knowledge I have, I think it's absolutely zero chance that I ever have insomnia, because the idea to do something to try to sleep is just like completely, yep. I've seen where that leads. So I think I'm kind of completely like super immune. So I think if anything, it leads in that direction.
Yeah, totally. I think I also have the same kind of like perspective right now on this. It's like the idea that there is any point in trying to induce sleep, it's, to me, it seems like almost like nonsensical. It's like there's no point in trying to, you know, use all sorts of tricks and, you know, like methods to control sleep, because there is like, for me, I feel like through this kind of process of ups and downs and seeing that I cannot control my sleep over and over, that actually led me to kind of like realizing that I don't have to do anything, and whatever the mind comes up with, like, you know, try this, I know it's going to be already, you know, losing strategy. So yeah. And but I learned this the hard way, like through going through ups and downs and, you know, like getting frustrated and then hopeful and then frustrated. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying when it's like, when you know how the trick works, like you're not that easily to be fooled. I usually like talk about this like as an analogy as watching a magician performing tricks. When you don't know how the trick is done, you might start doubting your own like sanity, like, oh, wait, is it possible that this thing can fly or whatever? Yeah, but then if you know the same magician will go like and say, hey, look, here's how this trick works, and just like really tells you all the details where like things go and appear. And then suddenly, like when the same trick is being performed, it's very hard to actually believe that trick anymore. It's like more like, oh, come on, I know that there is no magic. There is no like mystery around that. So yeah, this is how I feel about like insomnia recovery. It's really about understanding yourself, understanding like the tendencies the brain or the strategies the brain can use to perpetuate the cycle. And just sometimes just simple awareness can actually help you get out of this vicious cycle. Just being aware, you don't need to add any more actions, just understanding. I don't know if that's how I feel. It's like it really is about like seeing it for yourself.
I think, you know, I see it exactly the same way. And I so often I find myself in this place where people ask, you know, like, I'm sure, you know, you get this question all the time, but how do I do it? What do I do this? And like so often it goes to just like understanding, like seeing the big picture, because it can sound so impractical with how is that going to help me? But it's just like you say, when you see everything, understand everything, then you won't even ask like what to do, you know, because so again, yeah, I don't want to go into this kind of rabbit hole here, but just gonna completely emphasize that just the awareness itself, I think, is so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another kind of like analogy comes to my mind is that I usually tell it like when imagine that you go, like you went to grocery store and then somewhere like in the middle of a store, you realize like, oh my God, I think I forgot to turn off the stove. And then in that time, like the brain goes like wild, like, okay, maybe there is already fire and, you know, all sorts of crazy stuff. And then if you try to really calm down, oh, come on, let's think rationally, nothing is going to happen. There still will be part of our brain that's going to be like, you know, like, I don't know yet. Maybe it's going to be some trouble when I come back home. And then when you go back home and then we start, like, we actually see that there is like the stove was off all this time. Suddenly there is like there's no how, like, how did you turn off that brain from like, you know, alarming you? How did it happen? You didn't do literally anything. You just realized that there is no threat because the stove was off. So it's like, I mean, maybe it's a very simplified, you know, analogy, but I feel like in a similar way, once we start really truly understanding how things work, what are the tricks the brain is playing, and that's how we start getting like answers for ourselves, like how to approach certain things. So we are not going to follow that unconscious desire to protect ourselves from something that is only a perceived threat. So
but I'll just say that I've used your exact analogy countless times. It's a wonderful one.
Yeah, it's a good one. And actually, when I was also asking people to like, you know, to send me some topics for a conversation, and a couple of them actually wrote the same kind of like a topic, which is the role of education in recovery, and also the situation when you understand everything rationally. You really get the idea, like on this intellectual level, you know that, okay, that makes sense. But there is like emotionally, we feel like it's not clicking yet. It's like the brain, like something inside of us, like emotionally, is like, no, you're not there yet. So I was wondering, like, because I know that we usually talk about like how education is important, right? And understanding and learning about how things work, how insomnia works is helpful in demystifying this whole thing. But then there also seems to be like another part of the process. And I just wanted, like, maybe you could like talk about this a little bit more, about this kind of discrepancy between like rational and emotional understanding.
Yeah, exactly. So firstly, I want to say that, okay, first I want to say that this place where more than one person, it seems, in the community describe themselves as is very common. It's like I understand everything on a logical, intellectual level, but how, nothing's really changing for me. Like I'm still in the struggle, although I understand everything. It hasn't really sunk in. It hasn't gone to my subconscious. I don't feel emotionally. That place is very, very common. So anyone hears this, like, it's a very common place to be in on your path to where you want to be. But of course, that leads someone like you and me to wonder, like, okay, but how can we help somebody who is in this place? So I spent a lot of time thinking about this exactly this place. And with that in mind, going back to the question of education, I want to say that I do think of education as like kind of like two types of education, or two ways to learn. And mostly when I use the word education, I do mean like the traditional education, which is kind of like just tuning into YouTube channel, understanding, okay, you like that, but there's also sort of a emotional, like we can educate ourselves, but just by taking in information, and we can educate ourselves by experiencing something. Like, so there's this experiential learning from what is happening to us, and that is often just as helpful as like kind of the just like book education or book learning. And for someone who's like, what do you mean by learning by experience or emotional learning? Well, it's something like a nice topic for this is the magical moment, when somebody is like, goes to bed and like, I understand everything intellectually, I understand it emotionally, this is never going to work, I'm never going to find my way, and then they just like fall asleep and sleep the whole night, and like, whoa, how did that happen? Well, we can't maybe necessarily intellectually understand that, but somehow the education seeped in, and it just happened. And now you experienced what you knew intellectually, which was that sleeping well takes no effort. Now you've experienced it. And like experiential learning, I think is often what leads kind of like to things clicking and like a deeper understanding, if you will. So I want to point out this kind of learning through experience. And it can all, now I use the magical moment, which is kind of the uplifting, nice way to learn, but it can also be kind of the painful experiential learning, which is that, trying like over and over again to find a solution and feeling just get this painful feedback, like nothing is getting better. But somehow that can be kind of this experiential learning too, where you have the intellectual understanding that more effort leads to more struggle, but then you start realizing it like on a gut level or intellectual or like on a subconscious level, that all the struggle I'm going through is actually through all this effort. And that can also be part of that experiential learning. And the final word on this is, the teaching that I've come up with, which is so far, I think the most helpful that I've come up with for somebody in this place, is this like North Star teaching. So yeah, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, but some may not be. So I'll share it real quick. And it goes as follows. So it is well known in, let's say, the entrepreneurial space, or like, let's say, business space, that it is well known under which circumstances or conditions humans do their best work, their most helpful work, most productive work, etc. And when I teach this, I always like to ask people, so imagine this, like, your boss tells you, this is what we want, and you're going to have this manager checking you every day and giving you feedback and monitoring your progress and making sure you get there within this amount of time. That's kind of condition A. And condition B is like your employer says, this is what we want to see happen, and you figure out how to get there. You have our complete trust to see that happen, right? And we all intuitively know that we will do most helpful work in condition B, we just intuitively know that. And then I always say that the same kind of applies like within us, that intellectually, where you want to get, right? But often we become this kind of micromanager within ourselves. We're like, this intellectually, why isn't this happening? Get there, and we become this kind of like, we go into condition A, where what we want is more condition B, where we point out this North Star. The North Star is like, letting go effort, for example, or like something like that. What we want to see happen is this, and then we go like, but brain, you figure out how to get there, And then some people will be like, but how do we do that? Then we can go back to the analogy and be like, but now we're trending into the micromanager again. Like, what you want is just North Star, let the brain figure out how to get there. So that can really help.
Yeah, no, totally. When we were saying this, I could easily see myself, like when I was struggling, exactly when I would just like, okay, just like orient yourself towards this goal, let's say acceptance or letting go of effort, but let go of, like this precision, this like micromanagement. For me, the brain would go like, but how can I do this? And then there's like constant this how and how and how. And I would say that when we get into this state, when we feel like we need an instruction to every single step, that's already a good moment when we can like use awareness to just like, oh, here's the pattern. I keep asking this how and how and how. And even though like, we can, probably like suggest a certain like way, or at least how we saw people, used, approach this, right? But still, it doesn't mean that it will completely resolve the whole, like, give the complete answer to this, because then there is like, after first how, there is another how can I do that, and how can I do that, and so on and so on. So at some point, like making sure that we get the answer to the how, it becomes kind of like obsolete. It doesn't lead us anywhere. At some point, we need to realizing that probably also the whole process of like, okay, asking like, how can I do this? How can I do this? Is the effort in itself, is this kind of like some sort of like a compulsion to get everything right. And I would say what you basically mentioned here is that when there is this kind of like discrepancy between rational and emotional understandings, big component there is this self-kindness and compassion, because exactly, we don't know exact steps how to implement, like, what exactly things I should do in order to, let's say, befriend wakefulness, or I don't know, like let go of sleep efforts, because of course we can say like, okay, just stop doing something, right? But that's not that easy, because when you get into details, it gets very subtle, because if you stop doing certain efforts, but then there is intent or this kind of like a pressure to sleep afterwards, then it becomes another effort, right? So there is like a deeper understanding. So I would say that in this very tricky process, we also need to kind of like deploy heavily the self-compassion and kindness concepts, because it's really hard to be perfect. It's actually impossible to be perfect on this path. So yeah.
I was going to say exactly. And I, as you were speaking, there were kind of like two things that came up in my mind that I really wanted to share. And one is like, as you know, we in the school, we have this kind of Zoom session, drop-in sessions. And a couple of years ago, I had this one student who was like, had this moment, the moment that the person asking the question wants to have, where like the intellectual things kind of sink in, and you're like, oh, now I feel it too. Like it's starting to change. And then I was like so curious. I was asking her like, so what was it? Like what led to that change? What teaching? What did you hear? And she was like, I don't know. It just coalesced, and that was kind of a moment for me to realize like I'm looking for like the magic like teaching, but it's never is like that. It is kind of like something that happens in a mysterious way. But to get that a little bit more tangible, I would say that that mysterious way it happens is actually very, very common. It's like a little child, right? You're teaching them how to speak, and you want to teach them how to say the word tomato. How do you do that? All you can do is like hold up a tomato and you say tomato, right? But how do you get the child to understand that this is the tomato and to say tomato? I don't know. Nobody really can understand that. Yes, it happens. At some point, it happens. At some point, the child will say tomato, and then, that it happens. Like, so anyway, I can also
it's a good point.
Right? Yeah, no, go ahead, Ali.
No, it's a really good point. I think what you're talking about is basically also like trust, that it will click. We cannot control when this, the knowledge will click, when there will be a perfect kind of like moment when, everything what we knew intellectually, and then everything what we are experiencing, like, in real life, it kind of comes together and produces this insight or aha moment. And these moments, they do happen on the journey, and I would say like there are multiple ones. It's not just like one big aha moment and then everything is resolved. It's more like I had from time to time had a lot of these kind of like moments that happened out of nowhere. It's like I could never ever have prepared for them, like planned them. It always came spontaneously. But interestingly, it came spontaneously after I did some input into this. And the input was understanding, like learning, and okay, I understand how it happens, like, let's say, on a theoretical level, and then also experiencing, living the experience, and then somehow like the brain kind of like makes connections, and I was like, oh wait, probably this is, like, and then there's like a new knowledge arises. And there are several moments like this, at least like in my journey, there were several moments like this, like when it was like aha moments. And I realized that at some point I developed this, it was again another this control tendency, where I try to induce those moments, like I try to force those insights. Like if I read something, I always, or at least like at the time, I felt the pressure to make it click. So it was like, it was for me very essential that it would have the same impact on me as, previous like clicking moments. But then I realized, like, by me trying really hard to get some insight or this kind of like internal clicking, I'm actually postponing this moment.
Yeah.
This was actually very helpful, because then I realized, like, what, based on my previous experience, every time an aha moment happened and something like clicked, I never ever knew what led to this. So what if I just trust the process? I don't know, like I would just keep doing what I was doing or whatever, like, keep doing my thing, and then we'll see what happens. And out of that effortlessness, usually like the, some nice, aha moments appear. So that's how it usually is. And I think like trust is like a really good component here. Maybe like trust, letting go of efforts, all of that. It's also creates this soil for this learning to, to bear fruits. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but I was wondering, do you think that there is something that could obstruct this process of like natural kind of like learning, and it's like, oh, like I learned something and then I'm kind of like experiencing it in my own life, and then I draw some sort of like, insights from it. Do you think that there are certain kind of like patterns or thinking behaviors that kind of like, slow this process down or prevent it somehow? Maybe you've noticed, like, from observing people.
Yeah, well, I'd say that one of them is the one you mentioned, which is the effort, like having kind of a nice aha moment and starting to see click, and then try to make that happen again, and it can never happen. Like something like that happens kind of mysteriously, magically, cannot be produced or repeated. And it's the same, like, again, it's the same in life in general. You might have at a moment where you're like, you went on a picnic with a friend because they just called you and said, hey, you want to have a picnic, and you decide to bring some wine, and another person joins, and it's just like the perfect moment. The weather's amazing. You have this incredible conversation. And then, if you 2 days later, you're like, I want to do that again. I want to have that again. It can never happen because it happened. It just happened, So that, like, trying to force it, of course, like the effort again can be tricky. But the other one, which I see, probably, if I'd pick the one thing that keeps people in like keeps people from kind of leaving the struggle and staying longer in the struggle, it is self-criticism. I think that's the pressure. I think when somebody has kind of intellectual understanding, it almost always boils down to kind of pressure that keeps them from, seeing where they want to be. And a lot of people don't really see that. They're sort of like, what do you mean, Daniel? Like the self-criticism? I'm just wondering, like, why can't I get over this? What's wrong with me? Like, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? And the tricky thing there can be to see that these questions, they look sort of like innocent, open-ended, exploratory questions, like, what am I missing? But what you're actually saying is something like, you're missing something and you better find it, is kind of, what am I missing? Or when you say like, what's wrong with me, it's basically saying like, something is wrong with me, you just haven't figured out what it is. So these thoughts are kind of a masked way of like us criticizing ourselves and putting pressure on ourselves. And that, I think, is what can keep us in a struggle for longer than what would otherwise be the case.
Yeah.
Big invitation for self-kindness there.
Yeah, I think we're going in line with what you said, is also this, what I notice is sometimes people get kind of a little bit stuck on the idea that I'm beyond repair. Like I cannot imagine myself getting better. And that kind of like this relationship with yourself also plays a big role. Like it's not just like the judgment of the process or how you're showing up to the process, but also judgment of yourself as a human being, like that there is something wrong with me and it's been wrong with me all my life. And maybe there's this kind of like a little bit of the, generalization of like basically your value as a human being is being linked to this process. And if you're not good in this process, then it also means that you're not a good human being. And I think this kind of thinking also keeps people from like discovering that, yeah, like there are steps already taken towards recovery and they're not nothing. But yet there is this kind of like the thought like, no, I should make bigger steps. I should make like larger or, more noticeable progress. And that can keep people stuck. But I think it's really pretty much in line with what you mentioned on this self-criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. And just adding one little thing here is, one very common thing I hear is somebody saying like, hey, Daniel, I watched like so many of your success stories, but I can't help feeling that, my story is different. And I wonder, like, can I ever truly, like, is it possible for me to leave this struggle? And we all know it is, of course, possible, but it can seem really impossible in that moment. But, where this leads me to is that today I had somebody on the channel, like I recorded a success story, and I've been meaning to actually, or I've been pondering, like, should I maybe ask every single guest, was there a moment when you thought I'm beyond repair? Like, and so that was on my mind. So I was like, yeah, maybe try today. Like, it seemed like a right moment. So I asked the guest, like, was there a moment like that? And he actually smiled. He was like, yes. He was like, of course there was. I thought I was the only one who was never gonna. And so, which was a nice moment of relief. And like for the audience, I'm sure it'll be a relief. But I'm thinking of maybe asking that every single time because it's so helpful to hear that.
Yeah.
Pretty much everyone thought so at some point.
Yeah, exactly. I find like now seeing also other people's like journeys, and then also like, comparing from, my own experience. And then I can see that insomnia is not, first of all, like you also say it quite often that insomnia is not unique. And I also feel like insomnia is very predictable when you understand how it works. It's like, it's a weird thing, but when you kind of like look at from a side, like on how the person describes their experiences and what their thinking patterns, sometimes you can already sense like, okay, here is probably in a couple of days there will be a speed bump. I don't know, I just had this kind of sense. And then it usually does, I mean, sometimes happen, like they say, oh, actually I hit a speed bump, right? And then there is like, it's so like predictable. And yet, that even if there are this kind of like speed bumps and, like, ups and downs, that it's still possible to kind of like go beyond them and, reach the place where this is no longer suffering. Yeah. But it's funny how insomnia is like, so the experiences are pretty much the same in people. But I would say also like, it also depends like how person approaches them. Like it's maybe there's also a little bit like personality thing, because I was more like, now when I work like with different people, I could see that there are some people are more kind of like resilient and maybe like more optimistic to this. And usually they're like the way how they get like things is like very like quite fast. Of course they experience like ups and downs, like it's completely normal for everyone, but there is this kind of like pattern that helps them learn like faster. And I remember like for me it was slower because I'm on the self-critical side. I'm more this kind of pessimist. And that's why for me it was like very helpful to, let's say, watch your videos, which were more about like optimistic side, like, like more like lighter, because then it helped to kind of like relieve that part of this kind of like pessimism that I had. But for me, it was also a lot of time spent in this kind of like doubt, basically, whether I can ever recover. I can see that, yeah, there are some times when I get better, then things get worse, but I cannot imagine myself not having ever to think about this. And I would say for a big part of my journey, that was like, quite predominant thought. Every speed bump was like this. And this is what I noticed is like, every time we get into a speed bump, like we always feel like we regressed. It always feels like regress or even like square one situation. And then when we start noticing it, and then some people actually grasp it very quickly. And some people takes more of those kind of like iterations to learn that. But then we start like observing patterns of behavior and thinking that we have during those, you know, speed bumps. And once we start noticing like, okay, every speed bump feels like the worst or the new, like something is completely, it's like brand new thing. It's like, it's not like what I had before. Yeah, before I felt like it was new, but now this is new. And then every speed bump feels like it's never going to end. It's basically like you don't know like when it will end. So the brain goes into the worst case scenario, which is like it's going to last forever, right? Even though there is experience of us having also like rough speed bumps, but then they were coming to an end. But when we are in the middle of it, I feel like understanding the general patterns of how the mind behaves during speed bumps can help us start to kind of like extrapolate our knowledge on further speed bumps. So next time when the speed bump hits, we know that it's completely normal to feel like, okay, I have no idea what I'm doing here. It's completely normal to feel like that, oh, I'm back to square one. It doesn't mean that you're back to square one, but it will feel like you're back to square one. So when we just normalize all these kind of like patterns, which we feel like so true and we need to really pay attention to them as something that is like super automatic and belongs to every sort of like, you know, turbulent period, this is when we start kind of getting out of those cycles, if that makes sense. So I feel like this is also something that helps people to kind of like kind of move on this journey, is actually be able to observe their behavior and learn from that, like see patterns and kind of like uncover the tricks. And the faster we do it, the faster we actually can sense like, oh, okay, I know where my brain is going. I know what will happen in a couple of days. And I would say this kind of like this, you know, higher vantage point is actually already leads us to recovery you know, to the point when we no longer are afraid to even go into a speed bump, because we know that it's not going to be special in objective sense. It might feel special, but it's not going to be special. So that's
yeah, no, 100%. Very, very nicely said. The higher vantage point. I really like that. And you know, what came up in my brain as you're saying that was that I've never actually referred to this as speed bumps, but I realized as you're talking that this is sort of very similar to speed bumps, or maybe it is speed bumps, what I've experienced on another journey, which is the journey of like, you know, the journey of a YouTuber, educator, like, you know, entrepreneur, you know, and I had so many moments. I've lost count of how many moments when there's been like some, you know, the inflow of new clients goes down, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong? And then like, this probably means that it was just a fluke. Like, you know, this is going to collapse. Like, it's going to go to nothing. Like, you know, and then it's like, oh no, there's new students now. Okay, that was fine. And then a couple of months later, like the exact same thing happens. But after a while, it's like, Daniel, you thought everything was wrong, and you've done everything wrong like 11 times before. It's not so, you don't take it so seriously anymore, you know. So it's the exact same thing. And yeah, I meant to create some content around that, like but now you gave me an idea. Like, I'm gonna call it like my speed bumps, which is like, you know. But anyway,
no, but it's also idea. And I also think that it's also about like when you feel like, okay, I'm doing everything wrong, something is wrong, then I need to fix it and so on. I think when we are also in the process, the opposite can be true actually. When we have kind of like a very, very strong confidence, like a little bit even too confident, you know. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
as I say, it is more like
time.
I did something and I know it's the best thing ever. I'm sure it's gonna be, you know, sometimes I do this kind of like I write a newsletter or a post and I'm like, oh my God, I love it. It's the best. It's like, it's gonna, you know, probably, you know, be well received by everyone. And then you actually post it and then there's like very few people actually react. And versus something that you felt like, okay, I'll just share it, but I don't feel it's something special, but it's okay. And then that thing gets like a much more kind of like recognition. But this thing that you were so sure that is going to be like the best thing ever, it's not. And this is actually funny because that's how, like, what I experienced. Like, for me, it's also, I feel like I have a second recovery process, but with this work that I'm doing like in other areas in life. So it's like the journey kind of like continued, like the sleep topic fell out. It's no longer an issue. But then I realized like, oh my God, there are so many patterns I see that happen in my life. And I'm going through the same, like I'm going through the speed bumps, but in those areas. And yeah, it's so interesting to observe it, because it's, as you said in the beginning, like human brain works in the same way. It doesn't really matter what's the content or the topic, but the strategies, the patterns we have are pretty much the same for these situations.
Yeah. No, I'm smiling so much because I recognize the flip side of it too. The kind of like hyper optimistic, like I figured everything out too. Like I've had that moment so many times as well. And one of them was like, oh, I'm gonna sell hoodies that sell like Sonata. You remember that? The Sonata hoodie? Like merch is the next thing. That's gonna like explode and it's gonna be like fueling the whole movement. And like there was literally like one person, one fan, you know who you're out there, bought one, and that was amazing. But that was okay. That's not okay. That's not good. Then I was like, oh, wait. We're gonna have voice messages within bedtime, so people can send a voice. People are gonna love it. It's gonna explode. This is gonna be the biggest thing. And like a few people use it, like I've had so many of those moments too.
Yeah.
But hey, not to sidetrack you or something, but you brought up another topic that it's up to you if you want to go into it or whatever. But it was so interesting because you said there are these, like, you observe somebody who is maybe a little bit more hopeful, optimistic as you start working with them, and they seem to get things fairly easily, right? They also have speed bumps, of course. It's never linear, but fairly easy. And you said, like, for me, I was very like self-critical, and I this is something I've never developed, but maybe we should develop this. I think it would be helpful. But think of like, what are the, I don't know, the avatars for people we work with, and what is sort of their challenge, right? And for some people, it is the very like, sort of the sad, like the sad, person who's like kind of withdrawn and really sad, right? And then we have the person who's like super anxious, like fire, explosions, like everything's happening, like blah blah blah. Yeah. And then you have the sort of the deep thinker, the person who like really ponders and thinks and wonders. And then you have like self-criticism, which can be part of all of them, but anyway, that's one thing. But I would, if I were asking like Alina, I would say like I had you down as the deep thinker, not so much the critical, like the one who like really thinks about things like really deeply. But I think anyway, there's some value probably in pondering, like, about these kind of avatars, if you will, and thinking about like what could be really helpful for this person, that person, without exactly trying to go into like, of course, this person needs this, and this is going to solve the problem. But anyway, thinking along those lines could be really helpful, I think.
No, I think it's actually a good idea. I think we should do something like this, because mapping out like personality types and their typical recovery processes, that could be actually helpful, because I can see that sometimes some people who are in a certain, like personality category, they have their journey looking this way, and then someone who is another personality category recover in a different way. It doesn't mean that one personality is like better than the other. It just maybe it just needs to it calls for another approach, or maybe for another set of like not teachings, but maybe a different perspective, or maybe different like expectations, like for how this journey go. That could be actually quite helpful, I would say.
I think so too. And when I, sometimes I think like, oh, we figured out insomnia, we know everything. But then when we bring this up, I'm like, oh no, we're just scratching the surface. Like this is a whole new area with so much work could be needed. But just a side to it.
It's like the more you know, the more you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, like when we were speaking about this kind of optimism and confidence and things like that, what came to my mind is that I also noticed, like, as one of the I don't want to call it like it's an obstacle or something like bad. Of course, it's not bad, but this is like a certain pattern that I noticed, is that this some sort of like conviction that I'm doing everything right and I'm perfect at this, but I'm not seeing results. So there is like I don't know if you've also encountered this type of like journeys, but I feel like sometimes being overconfident, like, oh, I'm either it goes like to this kind of like a extreme, like I'm nailing it and things cannot get worse ever, this is kind of like prepares them for another speed bump. Because for me, I also felt like sometimes like when things go really well, I get like I got kind of like a little bit like cocky, or I don't know how to say it, like, oh, I figured it out, like everything is fine, right? And then there would be a humbling moment when a speed bump would hit, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know anything, and there would be a lot of frustration. And sometimes that moment when I realize like, oh, actually, probably I don't know as much as I thought I know. I know something, but not everything, right? So that humbling moment like really helped me to kind of like really let go during that speed bump, and then like realize like, okay, actually I'm not in control here. I haven't figured out how to sleep or how to prevent, you know, anxiety. So it kind of helped me to be even more self-kind, because I know that I'm a student here. I'm a beginner, like I'm a constant beginner, right? And this mentality like really helped me navigate through those like really tough moments, because if I would continue with this kind of thinking, like I nailed it, right? And then when I'm going into a speed bump when I'm not sleeping well, and then I still have this kind of like, I nailed it, but then there is something is not working. Like, let's say concept doesn't work anymore. It like something is like, you know, that's kind of like skepticism, like in terms of, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense actually, as I talk about it,
Yeah.
but I feel like there is this kind of like a moment when the journey can be a little bit like stretched due to this maybe overlooking that there's probably certain things that we might come to realize that we don't know that much. And
Yeah.
it's okay to not know that, but it's okay also to admit that. It can be actually helpful to realize, you know what, probably I didn't nail it, and that's okay. And I'm gonna just, you know, like go with the flow and take it day by day. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just wanted like to bring it there, like one of the type of reactions during
Yeah,
insomnia.
no, I 100% makes sense. And you know, I've sort of fallen into this one myself many times, where I had a student who pretty early on said like, hey Daniel, like you know, I've checked out your videos and I'm pretty confident. I'm almost there. I just need maybe little pointers. And then I kind of go like, yeah, based on what you're telling me, I agree with you. You probably just need little pointers. But that person actually ends up having quite a difficult time, because they came in with a notion that they almost figured it out. They're pretty confident, and you know, just you know, and so you're absolutely right. And the other, you know, category, if you will, is somebody who's like, but I'm literally doing everything you're telling me. Not only that, I'm really, really good at it.
Yeah.
But I'm still not getting any results. And that's so tricky, because like the idea that you can nail it in terms of like mind control and controlling your emotions in itself is untrue to me. Like you cannot nail that. So it becomes you have to be kind of carefully teaching that person that the idea that you've perfected what we teach is kind of completely unaligned with what we teach, and therefore, of course, you're not seeing the result you want, you know. So yeah, there are many tricky paradoxes here, but I've seen these many times.
Yeah, it actually makes me think about, like, I don't know, probably we are like going too much into detail here, but I really wanted to share. It's been on my mind actually lately. I feel like there can be several layers of struggle, like several layers where struggle occurs, and sometimes people have just one, and sometimes people have just like all three. And I've been in all sorts of like combinations myself there. So the first layer of struggle, or maybe like the first layer of where hyperarousal and pressure can come from, is of course like the sleep topic itself. Like, I must sleep, I should not be awake at night, I should not wake up, I should fall asleep quickly. So all this kind of like pressure, like shoulds and shouldn'ts, right, create anxiety, so that when we don't sleep well, then we feel like, oh my God, I have to do something to fix this. Then there is a second level or layer of that pressure. It is a level of emotions, how we react. So then we begin to judge our reactions to that. And this usually happens as education also goes on. So first we learn about like, okay, I realize that probably like the reason why I'm struggling so much with sleep is because of hyperarousal. And hyperarousal is because of a learned threat of not sleeping, right? or learned fear of not sleeping, which the brain uses as a threat, right? And then it makes sense, right? And then person like goes on the journey, and then they stumble upon another issue, which is like the second layer, when they realize that there is a little bit too much of hyperarousal than they would like it to be, and they become very pressuring to get rid of that hyperarousal. So this is on the second layer. I feel like there is this kind of like fear of fear starts to emerge.
Yeah,
so it's not just
exactly.
like fear of wakefulness or fear of sleeplessness, but there's like fear of hyperarousal, fear of this. So and then also a person like struggles with this a lot. And then there is this subtle, not everyone probably has it, I had it, layer of pressure is the pressure of recovery itself. Like, I have to be perfect at the recovery, and I have to do it right. I have to do it efficiently. I shouldn't waste time in my recovery, which is again like you're trying to micromanage your like the whole recovery process, and therefore you creating even more struggle for yourself, because recovery is never perfect. Or we can say like all recoveries are perfect in whatever form they develop, like even if it's like speed bumps and everything. So there's no such thing that is like, oh, you could perfect the art of recovery. There's no such thing. And sometimes people can get stuck in this subtle meta third layer where they feel like I need to nail it. And sometimes they might feel like, oh, I'm nailing it, but then I don't see any like outcomes there. So therefore, like relaxing a little bit this pressure in this, like how recovery goes, and creating less expectations or requirements on yourself, or how you should behave, or how fast you should, learn. That could be also very helpful. I think it's just something that came to my mind as we were speaking about that.
No, it's I believe it's all 100% true, and I'm working on this framework that I think you probably come across, like the token and tokenization and stuff like that. But I have this, I share this with you, but maybe not everybody knows this, that I have an ambition to sometime write this like my magnus opus, like the book where I put everything, like I compile everything. And the working title now is like Principles of Natology. I kind of like it because it's serious and funny at the same time. But one of the concepts I'm thinking a lot about is like, okay, so how, taking this beyond insomnia, how can we kind of like classify or understand all the different like internal struggles we may have, right? And so in many struggles, I think there's what I call a token. And a token is something that's innately harmless, but that started to represent danger to the brain. And if you think of it as something quite straightforward, like somebody's scared of balloons, well, then the balloon is the token. It's not dangerous, but it started to represent danger to the brain, right? And, for someone who has been afraid of being awake, well, insomnia, I should say, that the token in insomnia is wakefulness. Wakefulness is innately harmless, but it starts to represent the brain. That's the token, right? But why do we want to get away from wakefulness? It's because we're afraid of it. So we not only want to get away from wakefulness, but we want to get away from fear. In fact, I would say the fear is truly what we want to get away from, because that's what's so uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
That's what we don't want to experience. So for some people, the token is really where it's at. As soon as somebody understands that, oh wait, this is just a token, there's nothing there, then the fear of the token goes away, and then there's no fear to be afraid of either, and it becomes fairly easy. Like they leave the struggle that way. But for somebody who's lived in this for a long time, then it's not only actually a fear of the token, but there has been like this like what you call kind of the second layer, which is like the fear itself has been so uncomfortable that this person is afraid of feeling scared, right? So they're not only afraid of the token, but they're also afraid of what I call the tokenized emotion. An emotion has become tokenized. Now the emotion itself is something that represents danger, and we're scared, all right? So and this, like the practical values can be something like, going back to the balloon example, is if somebody has kind of like just a fear of the token, then it can be fairly easy to kind of understand, like, okay, there's nothing dangerous with balloons. I'm going to expose myself to balloons. I'm going to hold the balloon. It's all right. Okay, I don't think I'm afraid of balloons anymore, right? But if people are in this kind of more second layer, then the opposite can happen. They'll be like, oh, I got to get rid of my fear. Oh, and the key is to expose myself to a balloon. Here's a balloon. Here's another balloon. I'm full of balloons, but I'm still like really, really scared. That person is trying to expose themselves to the token, which is the balloon, to escape the tokenized emotion, which is the fear, right? So they're still escaping the fear, which is really, really tricky. So, what you want to do then is, of course, understand this, and I see that at the root of this is like the willingness to experience the fear is actually kind of the deeper layer, which leads to a relief in, everything kind of above it, if you will. But yeah, I know now I go into another tangent here, but I hope that's interesting and helpful.
No, but it's a really good way of explaining things, this tokenization, because that's like, I think fear of fear is one of the main kind of, or
100%,
one of the most common kind of situations we get into as we move on the journey. Maybe we start with fear of wakefulness, right? And then on top of that, the brain goes like, oh, so you say that fear keeps me awake, therefore I need to, hunt down the fear. And then we have this kind of like witch hunt for emotion, which is like completely normal for human survival, right? And what I usually like, that's what I started also like explaining as well, is when I hear like someone is afraid of the fear itself. And usually what happens also with that fear is that the fear itself will somehow sabotage their journey. So they feel like their journey is blocked because they experience fear, because they cannot overcome it. And what I usually remind them of is that fear, or let's say anxiety, and sleep are not purely incompatible. Actually, we can be very anxious and we can still sleep. So removing the fear as an obstacle to recovery, removing like thinking that fear is an obstacle of recovery, that can be actually helpful. Then we realize like we don't have to get rid of fear in order to recover. We can go like with the fear as we recover, and then fear will drop away at some point when we learn to feel safe. But fear in itself is not really an obstacle. It does not mean that we are sabotaging our journey. And sometimes that actually brings a lot of relief, because then people know that, oh, okay, so it's okay for me to feel fear, because I'm not doing anything wrong by feeling this. And they feel easier about the fear itself. And paradoxically, the fear itself like starts to dissolve.
Yeah.
And this is like super, it is paradoxical how this whole thing works. But yeah.
Very much so. Very much so.
Common.
And
yeah. And I actually was thinking about like one more topic, because I don't really talk about it on my channel. And I had a few people ask me, but because I don't have much experience with this, so I didn't feel like it's like I would be like the right person to talk about it. But medication, like a tricky area for many people, and some people are, you've been using them for a long time. Some people are kind of like having this internal conflict whether they should go the path of medications or not. So I was just wondering, maybe we can just like spend a little bit of time of talking about it. And also I want to say that it's not going to be a medical advice or anything, just like you usually have like your disclaimers, but it's really not. So we are just going to share our experiences, maybe like opinions about that. So I was just thinking, like, what's your general kind of like stance on medication, using medication during insomnia recovery?
Yeah, no, that's like, I'm very happy to talk about this. And I would say kind of like to start off with something kind of big picture, I would say that my take on it is basically neutral, or which is another way of saying like it's not what matters. It's not what matters at all, is my take on medication. And when it comes to sleep, I often share that there is no medication in the universe that can make a human being sleep. It's just biologically, physiologically impossible. Like they can't do that. And then I often like to share that what I feel is kind of like, maybe the most fundamental principle, not only when it comes to sleep, but I think in general when it comes to these inner struggles, is the principle of effortlessness, which dictates that everything we want in this arena, which is peaceful sleep and peace of mind, is always effortless. Like that never ever came from anything outside of force, pressure. It is always effortless. And when somebody says, well, Daniel, that can't be true because when I took this medication, I just stopped feeling anxious. I would say that that does violate this principle, right? If you take that at face value, if you say that's true, that this medication made me less anxious, that then the principle is untrue. The principle of effortless has been violated, right? So how can we preserve this principle while still acknowledging that somebody may have taken a medication and fell asleep, taken a medication and felt less anxious, right? That comes to delegation, you know, which for those of you who are not familiar with that, delegation means that an act led to effortlessness. And that can be, for example, taking medication. Somebody feels really, really anxious. They take a medication and think, oh, good, this will take care of my anxiety for me, which leads to us no longer trying to get rid of the anxiety. And that is the magic. The magic is in the delegation, you know? So that I think I really want to point out that I believe this is true not only when it comes to sleep and sleeping medications, but also anxiety and anxiety medication. And to kind of just share a little bit of proof of concept there is like, you know, people can still be kind of skeptical, like, can this really be true? And what I often like to point out is that we do have a common phenomena, which is relaxation anxiety. And this is somebody who's like taking a medication that is sedating, and sedation is real. Like there's no, like anybody who's had a glass of wine knows that you feel kind of a little sedated, right? That's true. But sedation is not at all the same as feeling relaxed or calm, right? So very often people have this experience where they're like, hey, Daniel, like I took my medication, I took my Xanax or whatever it is, but as soon as I start feeling the sedation, I become really anxious. I become so anxious that I don't sleep all night. And that is, of course, because that person somehow is predicting or forecasting that the sedation will make them sleep. So they're like, oh, good, this sedation will hopefully make me sleep. But what if it doesn't work? What if the sedation doesn't work? What if nothing works? Those thoughts make that person really anxious, despite being sedated, right? So again, to me, it proves that what matters in our experiences is not like the chemicals or the medications. It is how we think about it, our understanding, you know. But I also want to really emphasize that I'm in no shape or way or form like anti-medication, not at all. Like whatever leads anyone to a place where they feel at ease, at peace, and they're like living their life and enjoying their life. That's fantastic. I'm just happy. When somebody's telling me like, hey, Daniel, like I just started this medication and now I'm feeling great, and like I'm just really happy for that person. If they ask me for some coaching or guidance, I might share it with them that I think it's more sort of like how you think about it when you take it, that's really the magic. That's what really is helping you. But if they don't ask me, I'm just like, that's good. You know, nice. I'm happy for you. So, you know, that's sort of like my stance on it, if you will.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. I think it's really helpful to hear that it's like the neutral kind of like attitude, because sometimes like I feel like there's a lot of like self-judgment going on when we, you know, think about like medications, and we feel like, oh, but I'm somehow, you know, doing something wrong if I'm taking them, or maybe that I, you know, I'm sabotaging my journey and so on. Or then they feel that, okay, I should go completely unsupported. And sometimes that could be just, you know, too much of a pressure. So it's not that, like, of course, like I'm also completely neutral to that. I don't really care whether someone takes something or not, because I would say that the when there is understanding of what is actually happening, then we are free to choose whether we want to take it or not. I would say when there is enough of trust in our own body's ability to sleep, then the decision to take or not to take pill becomes pretty much obvious. Then it's like when we know that my body is perfectly capable of sleeping, then there is no like really need. But when there is trust is still shaky and we're still building, there's completely no judgment if someone chooses to support themselves that way, because I know that sometimes like insomnia can be really brutal in the way how it manifests. So not always do we have strength to kind of like go with it on our own, completely kind of like unarmed. So yeah, But
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody has that in general in life. And like, this weird, or I don't know, weird, but this analogy, like, or saying came to me as we were speaking of, like, the biblical one, he without sin shall throw the first stone, it's something like that. Like, and it's like, if we think about our own lives, is there, like, do I never do anything whatsoever to feel less anxious, or like we all do, all do things like that. So who's anyone to judge anyone else, like, for like feeling kind of frazzled and I take somebody, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. We all do that,
Yeah. And thinking about myself, like before insomnia, I never had any sort of like opinion on on sleep medication or any anti-anxiety medication. It was more like, okay, apparently people use it like when they have trouble sleeping. And I remember like when I started struggling with insomnia, my first go-to this idea is like, okay, so I will just take a few like pills. Before before it actually spiraled down, my first initial this was like completely normal, like I can use some help, right? So there was no this kind of like, oh, it's a bad thing, I shouldn't do it. Of course, like afterwards I realized that I'm spiraling down because I'm really trying to control my sleep, and then even medication like was not doing anything. So but I would say that when something becomes forbidden, like we feel like, oh no, it's a taboo thing for us, first of all, our desire to resort to it grows like a lot. We feel so much drawn, like always, like maybe I should take it, maybe I shouldn't take it. And if we do resort to this kind of like help, then we often feel also guilty for doing that, and that's also not helpful. It's not the like then once we like, let's say, choose to take pill, and then we feel really bad for that choice, the suffering comes not actually from the pill itself, but from that interpretation that I made a bad choice. So I feel like when there is no conflict, and when like no inner conflict, and we don't think of it as something like inherently evil, then we become really free, because we know that we can totally use help if we feel it's needed. And at the same time, we know that we don't have to. So we kind of like, we have options. And this is when we have options, we feel we have gained the sense of agency in this process. It's not just like, okay, so insomnia like just takes me whatever it takes me. It's more like, okay, I realize that there are certain things that I cannot control, but there are choices I can make. And whatever I make the choice, if it's an informed choice, then it's whatever it is, it's going to be an okay thing. So yeah.
I found this book, actually, thanks to somebody in the YouTube channel who recommended in the comment. It's called like The Easy Way to Stop Smoking or something like that, but it's by Alan Carr anyway. And that was really super interesting read, because he had found so many similarities to what we teach, but in the realm of like smoking, stop smoking. But his kind of whole, if you would summarize his philosophy, it would go something like, the problem with smoking is that you have this tug of war. Like you really want to stop smoking, but then you also have this idea that smoking gives you so much. So you think you have to use willpower to just like force yourself to stop smoking, but that creates so much tension and pressure and friction that you just smoke, to relieve that tension and friction, something like that. But what I would there's just one short thing I want to share here, which is that he says something in his book which just like struck me like, wow. And I think this is very similar to how many in our community they're placed when it comes to medication and sleep. And he said that he said for a smoker has two desires in life. There only two things they truly, truly want in life. Their strongest, most deepest desire. And one of them is to smoke, and the other one is to stop smoking. And I was like, wow. You just feel like this is true. You can just sense it, that this person hates that they're smoking. They want to smoke badly. It's not bad for them. But they also have this idea that smoking is like gives me relief. It's like the one thing I want to do. I just want to have the cigarette, and that tension is so strong. And it's so similar to what we see with the medication for sleep, is that we often have a person who's like desperately wants to stop taking their sleep medication, but also just wants to sleep, right? And that friction from thinking like you have to do this to achieve that is really, really troublesome. So, and I often share that anything that relieves that friction is so helpful. And one of them is to like vitaminize the medication, seeing that it really doesn't do that much, but it's also not something you have to be like, I have to get off of it. Like just, being a little bit gentler, kinder to yourself is so, so helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this. And I think we can conclude on this topic. It was really amazing to speak to you. I think we went here into some like depth of, like specifics of some teaching. So I think maybe people will find something new there. But it was really nice connecting with you. And I hope that maybe in the future we can do something like this as well.
No, it's super nice, Alina. And, it was kind of eye-opening for me too, like how we can, do this more free-flowing, like longer content that leads to very interesting places. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Anytime.